Welcome to the ISO Show, dispelling myths and sharing tips for success to improve your business with ISO standards, with your host, Mel Blackmore.
Hello, and welcome to the ISO Show. For our regular listeners, you may be wondering who this new voice is. Don't worry, Mel will be back hosting on the next episode when she's back from a holiday. I'm Steph, and I'm the Communications Manager here at Blackmores, and I'm usually working quietly behind the scenes editing the podcast and occasionally writing show notes. As a reminder, in the last episode, Mel gave an introduction to the guidance document ISO 27002. She explained how it works in combination with ISO 27001, and she also went over why it's been updated recently and gave a very brief overview of those updates. Today I'm joined by Steve Mason, who you may remember from previous episodes. He's our information security guru, and today he's here to go into a bit more depth on the 11 new controls added to ISO 27002. So without further ado, welcome Steve.
Hello Steph, hi. Yeah, well thanks for the introduction, and it's good to be back on the roadshow. I haven't been on for a while.
Good to have you back. Now these 11 new controls, I know that we'll be going into more detail on a few of them in later episodes, but for now, do you mind giving us a brief overview of each new control?
Before we go into the controls in any detail, it'd be good just to pick up on some of the changes that happened with 27002. I think the first thing is to really bear in mind that the document is completely different from the previous 27002 standard, and I think it's a much better standard than before. I've heard people grumbling about it, but to be quite honest, I can't see what there is to grumble about. I think it opens a lot of opportunities for organisations. And the other thing is that all these new controls, there are 11 new controls. People will be thinking, oh crikey, that's more work to do. To be quite honest, I've run through this standard with a couple of clients now, and in both cases they've all said, but we already do that. And so I think these new controls are not a case of they're new controls, they're just emphasising activities that companies already do. So that's the thing to bear in mind. So don't panic about these controls. You'll probably find you've already got things in place. But if we go back to the actual standard, if we remember back in the old standard, we had sections A5, A6, A7, A8, and so on and so forth. In this one, we've only got 4 sections. We've got organisation, people, physical, and technological. What this has enabled the standards people to do is to reduce the number of duplicated controls. Because often you find a control in one set of controls, and you then think, all right, done that. Then you move on to another set of controls, you find the same control repeated, but in a slightly different way. But that's now been removed in that sense. Then when we look at these controls, each of them has been aligned to different attribute themes. So this is one of the big changes in the standard. We've got attributes and we've got sub-attributes. So the attributes are control type, information security properties, cybersecurity concepts, operational capabilities, and security domains. Now, maybe some people are already thinking, oh, I recognise those. Well, if you're into NIST or any of the other security, criteria and guidelines, they align with those. So it's going to enable you with your 27001 to say, well, I'm dealing with it in 27001, but I can see how it meets NIST requirements or how it meets SAS 70, all those sorts of standards that are around. Okay. And then below that we have the sub-attributes, which that's a name that I've given them. And these are all the different individual bits that make up those attributes. But you'll get to know those as you go along. The good thing about the standard is that when you open up the standard, you find the control number, and it immediately gives you a set of the attributes and sub-attributes that are covered by that control number. Now this can help with analysis, because if you know what your attributes are, if you know what your sub-attributes are, you can do yourself a bit of analysis to build up a maturity picture of how well you're putting those controls together. Also, a picture of which attribute is the weakest in your business. So you might be looking at control as an attribute type, and it might be preventative that comes up a lot as being a weakness. So you've got to improve your preventative. There might be one that says detective. That's where you've got to improve the detection of security and things like that. So this is going to be a benefit to organisations in doing some analysis. And at Blackmores, we've already developed a maturity assessment to help clients with this. But more on that at a later date. I won't go into too much detail on that one. The other good thing about the standard is that not only does it give you a statement of what the control is, it also gives you the purpose of the control. And boy, is that an eye-opener, because how many times have we been in assessments or been in audits and there's been a differing of opinion as to what the control means? Well, I don't think that's going to exist anymore, because the purpose will tell us what we should be aiming to achieve with that control. And that can't then be disputed so easily, unless somebody completely misreads the English in the purpose. But we should be okay with that. And I do like the fact we've got that purpose in there. So those are the real positives that are coming out of this standard. I think if any negative thoughts come out, hold fire on that, wait until you've actually got into it, wait until you've started to use it. And I think we'll all be looking back in a year's time, looking back at this standard and saying, wow, this is a breath of fresh air. So then on to the controls that we've got in place. So we've got 3 organisational controls that have been added. One is threat intelligence. The other one is information security for the use of cloud services. The other one is ICT readiness for business continuity. Then we've got one new physical control, and that's physical security monitoring. Then finally, we've got 7 technological controls. That's configuration management, information deletion, data masking, data leakage prevention, monitoring activities, web filtering, and secure coding. Now, people listening to that list, all of those controls, would have probably thought, well, yeah, I recognise that. I mean, threat intelligence. Who's not doing threat intelligence nowadays? Who's not thinking about security in the cloud? Who's not doing data masking or information deletion because of GDPR and the Data Protection Act? And who's not sort of trying to prevent data leakage? And I think this is where, as I said right at the beginning, that these controls are emphasising the changes that are happening within information security. It's a bit of a catch-up situation, which is always going to be the case with standards, because if they don't change for 7 years, then you'll always be in a situation where you'll be looking at, well, where's the market and where's it catching up? And I think people should always see the standards as a starting point and gradually add new controls as they know they need to add when things change within the IT security world. So if we look at threat intelligence, we need to just ask the question, what sort of monitoring and measuring are we doing of the different threats that are sitting out there in the marketplace? Do we have a mechanism by which that happens? Do we have tools in place? So organisations may be sort of looking at the sort of tools they're using to identify the different threats that are out there. It's really about, I think people would have heard of that term, event horizon. What's actually happening on the horizon around your scope of certification that could at some point in the future impact you? A very good example of this sort of threat intelligence is not actually down to computers and things like that. It was the pandemic. How many people saw that as a threat to IT when it came along in 2019? I've got one organisation that took it very, very seriously in November. It was 2019. That's right. Took it very seriously then, added it into their information security risk assessment and started to monitor it. So that when it finally hit and we got locked down on the 23rd of March 2020, they recovered within 24 hours. And that is a remarkable thing. And that's because they used threat intelligence to tell them what was happening. Now, that didn't come from any SIAM. It didn't come from the National Cyber Security Centre. It came from just listening to news feeds. So I think what's important is understanding the types of threats there are to your organisation and the types of threats there are to security. Remember, security is confidentiality, integrity and availability. And that pandemic was going to really impact availability and probably integrity. So that's why that got onto that client's radar. It's also important to think about, well, what sort of objectives do we need to set to improve our intelligence tools? We may have some very good tools in place, but are they actually doing what we want them to do? Are they picking up on everything? Find out where your gaps are, fill those gaps and add something in to improve your monitoring. Organisations can produce threat intelligence, but more typically receive and make use of threat intelligence produced from other sources. So whilst you've got your own sources of threat intelligence, don't forget there's a myriad of organisations out there that will be providing you with threat intelligence. But if you do select these organisations, make sure they are trustworthy and make sure they are recognised organisations. What you don't want is some fly-by-night giving you sort of intelligence that is a bit of a knee-jerk reaction to something. You want something that's sound, okay? And make sure that when we have got your system set up, that your detection of the threat out there is bringing you in that valuable information that you can use for improvement. So that's the first one, threat intelligence. Then we've got the information security use of cloud services. This is A5.23. Now, cloud services, what do we do about that? There is a couple of standards out at the moment on cloud security. The best one to probably use at this point is 27017. Now, there are a set of controls in the back of 27017, which will not only bolster existing controls in the standard, but will actually add about 9 new controls, which strengthen security in the cloud. Now, admittedly, that's focused around PII, but isn't that what we're trying to protect, is personally identifiable information much of the time? And by doing that, I think it naturally follows on, we protect other information. So do bear that one in mind. Try and use 27017, or look at some of the other standards that are around that might give you a bit of an understanding of how you can bring in controls around the cloud. There is another side to this. You've got to understand what sort of cloud you've got and whether you're a cloud service provider or a cloud service customer, because there are different sets of controls you can do around that. But we'll come on to that in a bit more detail when we go into these controls at a later date. Probably some of the improvements we can have around this is if we produce a cloud system, a cloud policy that meets client requirements, we begin to understand what security controls ought to go in place. So look at what your client is after. Have they specifically requested any security controls? And are these security controls that are not in place in existing standards? So always go back to that contractual side of things, and that should help. Then we move on to A5.30, that's ICT readiness for business continuity. When you first look at this, you think, oh, but we've already been doing this under A17. Well, look at that first word, ICT readiness. So this is the disaster recovery side. This is about your IT systems being ready, not just about the whole business. Okay, so I think we can address this simply through having good disaster recovery plans in place, making sure that any business continuity plans we've got takes into account your ICT requirements, and not just for the ICT department, but also for each individual department. What are their needs around computers and IT? I think the best way to tackle this is to make sure you've got a business impact assessments in place. If you've got 22301, which is the business continuity standard, you're going to do really well with this because you've already got most of it in place. But if you haven't got that in place, why not just dip in there and have a look at what the requirements are around business impact assessments? Because once you know the business impact assessment on ICT, you can then make sure that that's being addressed adequately to protect the security of your information. Then we move on to physical controls. We've got A.7.4. Now it says physical security monitoring. This was implied in the last 27001, 27002, because you always assumed that the security controls you would be doing monitoring anyway. But this is actually emphasizing it further. How many times do we have all our systems in place where we have a swipe card and we can detect who's coming into the office, or we have CCTV that's supposed to monitor the place? But how often do people just forget to monitor these things and perhaps go through them Nowadays, tools have got much more sophisticated, and they will send you alerts when there's unusual activity. So if I'm trying to swipe my way into a secure area 3 or 4 times in a row, that should send an alert saying, are you aware that there's an unauthorized person trying to get into this area? So that's going to help you. So make sure your tools are up to date to be able to do this. CCTV of, that sort of thing. It's probably a little bit more difficult to sort of pick up on things without sort of watching it. So it's always a good idea to balance your monitoring of CCTV with your physical security controls, or at least make sure somebody quickly reviews CCTV when it happens. So it might be that you get an attempt on a back door, that gets alerted. You might then go to your CCTV to see if there's anything that supports it. So we just got to understand what it is we want to monitor and how we're going to monitor it, and make sure that monitoring is sufficient to present to any sort of tribunal or any legal facility that might want to follow this up. So we come to the technological controls. This is where it gets a little bit more techie, but we'll get through them. First of all, we've got configuration management. Configuration management is quite an interesting one. If we think about configuration management, some of you may already have 20,000 as a standard. So there's that side, the configuration of IT systems. Do ICT systems, do they fit together? Do they talk to each other well? Have you got proper configuration management tools in place to make sure that your assets are not being removed or being changed around? It's always good to have that sort of thing. In the old days, we used to call them CMDBs, and the CMDB seems to have disappeared as a phrase. I think some people still use it, but which was CMDB is basically a configuration management database, and that's all we're really after here, is improving configuration. But the other side of configuration, this is a bit that I sort of dug into, is don't forget about the configuration that you have setting up some of your systems. We all have a configuration around the type of password that's needed. So what's the strength of that password? How many characters do we need in that password? Should it have upper and lower case? And that sort of thing. That is a configuration of your password. So that's something that needs to be checked. How often do we go in and check that? There were some technical reviews required in 27,000 in the old standard. I think this is to just strengthen that a little bit further. Check your configurations. So think of anything you've got set up as a set of instructions in your system. Perhaps you're logging on and that sort of thing. Make sure they haven't been changed, and do this as a regular activity. And always base that inspection upon risk to the business. Yeah, so the next one we come to is information deletion. Now, we may think that we've got to be very careful with information deletion because of GDPR, and that's quite true, because there are certain documents we can't just get rid of, and it's not just GDPR, it's all legal requirements. You've got to make sure data is always available. What this is really focusing on is making sure that if data needs to be deleted, it is deleted in a secure manner and can't be recovered. So we might have physical destruction of data. So we've got physical data. Make sure that we are destroying that in a proper fashion. We use shredders to get rid of the data. And make sure the shredder is the right type of shredder for the data you're destroying. I personally don't like those very fine dust shredders, because I think that's the next asbestos issue coming down the line, because it cuts it into a very, very fine powder. And I wonder how many people sort of have chewed up their paper and then open the bag and all that dust comes out and that gets down in your lungs. So I tend to veer away from those and say get your cross-cut shredders or other bits and pieces that cut things into slightly larger shreds and not down to the fine dust. So that's the physical destruction. Also, if you need to pass your physical destruction off onto a third party, make sure that third party has the ability to destroy the paper properly. And they're not just tipping it into a landfill, because you may have put it into a confidential waste bin thinking, oh, that's confidentially disposed of. No, it's not, because it's still in that sack. It's got to go for a ride with a lorry. And when it gets to the other end, what do they do at the other end? If they're just tipping it into a landfill, then that's not confidential disposal. you want to make sure when it gets to the other end, it goes through proper shredders, industrial shredders, to be turned into McDonald's cartons or similar things. So every time you eat a McDonald's or a Kentucky, not that I eat many of that stuff, but next time you eat those, the cartons are probably made out of somebody's financial report. So anyway, the secure deletion of software. This is quite important, that make sure that if you've got any soft data, that it is securely deleted. You can overwrite that data, but also make sure that if you're passing a laptop on or a PC on to another person or organization, that you've actually removed the software that's not part of the original makeup of that laptop or computer, because you'll have licensing issues there. So there's lots of different things to think about on that one. And then we move on to think about the restore to factory settings. That can be quite a useful button to select, just to make sure that everything's been removed, you're back to normal. But you need to still check that, once you've pressed that button, everything that should have been deleted has been deleted. And don't forget, there can sometimes be these hidden files in your systems that you need to go through. How many of us check our downloads folder to check that things have been removed? Because every time you download something from an email to read on your computer, it's gone into a hidden download folder, and there may be tons of information hidden in there that could be confidential and secretly get out of the organization if you're not careful. So what you're trying to do with this control is make sure stuff doesn't leak out of the information. So then we come to data masking. Now, data masking is in line with GDPR, and it should be something that we should be doing quite a bit of at the moment. We've all heard of obfuscation of data. That's one of the big words that's used in this area. Pseudonymization is another one. Well, that simply means that you replace a bit of information with false information. And anonymization is where you replace data with either nothing or complete nonsense, or you blank it out totally. All right, so this is just simply about making sure that data that shouldn't be shared is actually masked in some way, shape or form. There are lots of tools in place again nowadays that can do this quite easily. If not, it will have to be a sort of manual thing to do. And we should be thinking about the sort of information that where this would happen. It might be around personally identifiable information. It might be to protect health information. It might be for payment card information. You need to protect that. Any intellectual property there might be in the organisation. And any other information in the organisation that's considered to be strictly confidential. All of these sorts of things should be masked before they go out. If the person receiving the data should see it, is allowed to see it, then that's fine. But there are many cases where that's not possible. And so you've got to mask it in some way, shape or form. That one, I think, is probably, out of all these controls, if it's not already been done by organisations, maybe the one that people will ponder over a lot more. And we do have guidance on that in Blackmores that we can go into a bit more detail in another one of these sessions in the future. Then we come to data leakage. That sort of does fit in slightly with that information deletion, but it's a lot more than information deletion. Because if you don't delete your information properly, then you do get leakage. And what we're really thinking about here is any information that might escape via a USB stick, might escape in the memory of a mobile phone. It might be something that somebody's started downloading a lot of information to their own personal email address and things like that. So it's really having the monitoring tools in place to pick up on large downloads of information or changes in practices and that sort of thing. If you've already locked down your USB ports and things like that and locked them down to the point where you can't allow data out, then you've probably done a good job in doing that. But do have a look around where the system might be weak in data leakage. One of the worst cases of data leakage I saw, and I actually raised a major non-conformity when I worked for British Standards, and this was where it was director in HR had decided to pass on, it was a number of CVs and push them into her own personal email address, so it went back to her home address. And we picked up on this, and I said, well, why are you doing that? So she said, well, I need to work from home. And I said, but if you asked IT, they would have given you permissions to access your system on your computer at home. So you wouldn't need to do that. I said, all you've done, you've now put that data onto an account. It was a web account, and that makes it insecure. And so certainly in this day and age, this was just before GDPR, but certainly in this day and age, we would actually find that sort of thing quite horrendous. But it was actually a breach of the Data Protection Act. That's why she got a major non-conformity. So be aware of this. And it might be a case of just teaching people in the organisation that if they want to work from home, there are secure ways for doing it. Don't start using sort of web email addresses to start sending secure data around. So that's really what we're looking for leakage. The other leakage might be, and I've come across two cases of this, it's where somebody in a particular department in an organisation has taken a customer address book with them to a brand new job. And in both cases I heard of this, that person lost their job as soon as they handed it over. So bear that one in mind. You might think you're doing a great thing. It doesn't always mean that you're going to get a gold star at the other end, because the response that was received from the other organisation was, well, if you could do it to your old organisation, you will be doing it to us. So we can't trust you, therefore we terminate your employment. And that was within the first week of employment. So don't nick your customer database and take it elsewhere. It's not worth it. And that is data leakage. Make sure that sort of thing can't happen. So it might be a good idea for organisations to think about just a risk assessment around data leakage. Where can data leakage possibly take place? And what have they done to address those areas? Then we come on to monitoring activities. Yeah, monitoring activity. We've already got monitoring activities in the old standard event monitoring, but this really is just emphasising a bit more detail. There are lots of different monitoring activities you can sort of be looking at. It could be network traffic, it could be access to systems, logs from security tools. It could be use of resources such as CPU, hard disks, memory, bandwidth, software licensing and legitimacy, and any irregular activities. Think about what you need to monitor, what you want to monitor, and make sure that what you do fits the needs here. I think what they've tried to do with this control is to allow clients a little bit more flexibility in what they monitor, so they don't end up monitoring for monitoring's sake. They end up monitoring because there's a benefit to the organisation. So that's the key bit to get there. So again, it's a control. You know, most organisations say, well, we already do that. Yes, you do. But take a look at it again, and are you monitoring for the right reasons? Web filtering. Now, I've seen web filtering in place for years. Some organisations do it really well. Some organisations totally ignore it. So I don't know why. But web filtering is really about making sure that employees can't go to, or won't be able to go to, any website that is either nefarious or is a high risk of causing a breach or something like that. It might have viruses in it. So one organisation I went to, they were dealing with a lot of card payments, and they decided, yes, they would block all access to the internet. But what they did, they set up an internet cafe down in the rest area, so that people that needed to do their online banking and things like that could still do it on an off-network site downstairs in the cafe. Because this was an organisation that was away from town, so it kept the employees happy because they could still do their online banking and payments at lunchtime, but they still weren't putting their system at risk. So that's a thing to think about. Also think about sort of where you would be going to in your websites. We all go onto Facebook, we all go onto perhaps Twitter or all the other things that are around. I'm not saying they're bad sites, but sometimes there are adverts on those sites that if you click onto them might lead you through to a security risk where there's a risk of a virus getting in. So you just need to be very careful. So I would always advise clients, think very seriously about the sort of social media activities you're allowing people to do because of the risks. I think there have been cases of that on eBay as well. But it's not the fault of necessarily of the people running those organisations. It's just that it's available there for people to misuse if they want to. So that's your web filtering. Make sure that you only allow people access to good, wholesome websites that are only really there for the use of their day-to-day working, and not just a diversion from work. And finally, secure coding. Secure coding, people might say, well, we already had that in the last standard. Well, yes, we did. It does sort of surprise me that this one has come out as a separate new control. But really, it's just, I think, emphasizing what was in the last standard. Just saying that make sure that when you do coding, it is secure. Don't do a half job on your coding. I still come across people that still say to me, what is secure coding? And when you say, think about OWASP, think about NIST, they're still a bit baffled. So we know there are people out there that are not doing secure coding. Well, this one stops people wriggling out of that one. It says secure coding, therefore you shall do it. If you're doing any software development, you shall do secure coding. Like with the other standard, you could actually exclude some of the controls. This one you're definitely not going to be able to exclude if you're doing software development. Yeah, so really, secure coding, if you've got some good software developers, then make sure they're using good secure coding tools. Okay, and there are plenty out there. The standard won't tell you what ones to use, because it's up to you as an organisation to use what fits best with you. So I know I've gone on for a long time, but hopefully that's given a bit of a taster for where we are, and it would take many, many hours to go through each of those controls in a lot more detail. But as we've got other sessions coming up in the future, we can start thinking about unpacking these in a bit more detail.
Brilliant. Thanks, Steve. I think that's given people a lot to think about. Now, I know it's a lot to take in, so just a reminder that we'll have a quick guide to these changes available in the show notes. Also, keep an eye out for future episodes. We'll have Steve on again to go through a few of those new controls in more detail. If there are any in particular that you'd like us to focus on, then let us know in the comments.
What might be good, Steph, is if people have experienced putting some of these controls in place where they've experienced problems or found good ways of addressing the controls, share them with us so that we can then look at them as, good practice or best practice. That might be a way forward. It just gets everybody involved in this, because we're all part of one big team when we come to this. As long as you're not giving away company secrets by telling us, you should be all right.
Oh, it's a really good idea, Steve, yeah. So, as he says, feel free to share your experience with us as well. We'd love to hear about it. And on that note, remember to keep up to date with all our latest episodes by subscribing on your preferred player. So, we're on iTunes, YouTube, Stitcher, Spotify, and we've recently just launched on Amazon Music too. So once again, thanks to Steve Mason for joining me on this episode, and you can look forward to hearing Mel again on the next ISO show.
Looking to use ISO standards to drive better business practice? Contact us at blackmoresuk.com to access further information and book your free 15-minute call.